media impact funders. And I'm as mad as hell, and I'm not going to take this anymore. I've always wanted to say that. So that's not actually my feeling, but it is the sort of quintessential moment from the seminal film Network, which is now just opened up on Broadway last week. Really amazing production with Bryan Cranston in the role of Howard Beale. And it was a really amazing production, and it was an amazing film 40 years ago, prophesying a world where we have a toxic culture, where commercial media companies are chasing a diet of rage and vitriol in search of profits. And it is, I think, a world that we have arrived in where our media ecosystem is full too much of rage and vitriol. And we really need to find a way back to a public square that is a place where we can have sensible and respectful conversations, including all diverse communities in it. And fortunately, we have people in philanthropy working on this task. And today's session is on re-envisioning the public square. And we've got a really great partner in PACE funders who are going to lead this discussion. Really great thanks to Kristen Campbell, Executive Director at PACE Funders, and also special thanks to Ariel Suarez Murios, who has led the development of this session as well. Before we turn to that, just a quick moment of housekeeping. For all of you participating in this, we really want this to be a discussion with all of you. We know there's great expertise among participants, as well as the great Hollywood squares we've assembled for you of great speakers. So please submit your questions. There's a Q&A function. I believe it's in the top left of your screen if you scroll around. And provide the questions. We'll keep an eye on the Q&A function throughout. And with that, I just want to turn it over to Kristen Campbell, our great partner in this work. Thank you, Kristen.
Thank you so much, Vince, for your partnership, as well as your colleague Roshni and Sabira, who I know are on the call as well. And thanks for that introduction. I also want to thank all of you for being with us today. What brings us into this conversation at PACE, which stands for Philanthropy for Active Civic Engagement, what brings us into this conversation is a paper that we recently re-released called Infogagement. And infogagement is a term that we coined to describe the collision between the fields of media, technology, and civic engagement. The original impetus for our infogagement exploration was that there were PACE members working in various aspects of each of those fields, and they really were starting to sense and feel that those worlds were starting to collide. So PACE took some time to think deeply and explore what was happening and released the infogagement paper back in 2014. That paper really started to unpack the collision course that was emerging, and as we all know, we have been living in the wake of that collision for some time now. The wake and its ripple effects are what inspired us to re-release the infogagement paper and update it for our 2018 reality, and to include some fresh perspectives from leaders across each of those fields. And so while we won't go into the depths of that paper on this webinar, it does provide some grounding for the conversation that we hope to have today, which, as Vince started mentioning, is a larger conversation about this overall paradigm shift that we are experiencing. So we'd like to discuss how the shifts in the field of media and tech have shaped our public square and our engagement practices, and vice versa, how our engagement practices in our public square have reshaped or redefined our expectations of media and tech, and what steps we can take together to collectively re-envision the public square to make sure that our work and our civic spaces reflect the reality of how we live our lives today in this 21st century tech-enabled environment. The truth is the work to update and refresh our public square is already happening and already underway. I know I personally take some great relief in that. And the fact that our speakers on today's call are really at the heart of understanding and practicing what it means to re-envision and reshape the public square. So I'm really pleased and honored to have with us today Ashley Alvarado, Director of Community Engagement at KPCC, which is Southern California's public radio station. Sarah Alvarez, founder and lead reporter at Outlier Media, which is a service journalism organization based in Detroit. Eli Pariser, Omidyar Fellow at the New America Foundation, and Josh Stearns, Director of the Public Square Program at the Democracy Fund. So we're going to have the opportunity to hear from all of these folks in various ways, but I'd like to begin with a brief conversation with Josh and Eli as a way of framing our discussion today, and then we'll hear from Sarah and Ashley about their work, as they are, we think, really examples of what it means to have infogagement in action on the ground. But to start us out and help us understand and frame the discussion that we would like to have today, Eli, I'd actually love to start with you. When we talk about this collision that is taking place and has been taking place between media and technology, you were really one of the first people to start bringing that collision to public attention through your work around filter bubbles and helping us understand and really dig into the idea of how filter bubbles were influencing the way that we are receiving information and understanding what's around us. And the challenges that you talked about through your filter bubbles work have only become more complex and more complicated since then as more factors and conditions have come into play. So I'd be curious to hear your thoughts and your reflections about how the collision between tech and media has continued to evolve and become more visible, and what that means for how you think about this infogagement phenomenon now.
Hi, great. Well, thanks for inviting me to join here. And you know, it's a big question. I think when I started, you know, I before the filter bubble, I had been a digital activist working at MoveOn, helping lead that through the 2000s. And what originally kind of piqued my interest in the filter bubble phenomenon was this sense, you know, I had bought into that kind of early internet feeling that technology was going to solve all of our democracy problems, and that if we could just kind of get everyone connected, get rid of the gatekeepers, it was going to empower citizens to make change in a different way, and this was going to be a net good for democracy. And after, you know, kind of stepping back from MoveOn in 2009, I started kind of looking around, and I had this kind of hunch or this feeling that it wasn't quite working out that way. And I was watching the way that technology, instead of distributing power, actually seemed to be concentrating it. And so the filter bubble was really kind of my little self-appointed graduate study in two things. One was, you know, why does it feel like these public spaces where we're supposed to have conversation are increasingly kind of fragmented, disaggregated? It's harder even to kind of gather in one place anymore. And on the other hand, you know, sort of what's going on with the concentration of power to create these spaces. And so I think, you know, coming to 2018, you know, it's much more true that a few huge companies are really structuring the way that we have public conversations. Facebook, and, you know, probably by far the most important because of the amount of time that people have conversations there. We've never had one company or one person control speech for billions in this way before, but also Google and YouTube and, you know, other Twitter, certainly. There are these other sort of private spaces that are increasingly taking the role of the public square and feeding that through a set of kind of algorithms and distortions that shape what we get to talk about, what we get to hear, and how we engage with each other. And so, I think partly what we're grappling with on this call is the sense that the public square isn't public anymore. And what do we do about that? Or it's not fully public, either in the sense that it's owned by all of us, or in the sense that it's shared or common. Both of those senses, it feels like it's kind of drifted.
Mm-hmm. That's a really profound question. What happens when the public square isn't public anymore? And I think that creates a lot of interesting opportunities to talk about civic engagement. So I hope we'll get a little bit more into that today. Josh, kind of a grounding or contextualizing question for you. You and the Democracy Fund really exist at the intersection of all of the different types of fields that we've talked about when we've defined this concept of infogagement, and you are specifically in the Public Square program, apt for today's discussion, at the Democracy Fund. You're really supporting innovation in media at the systems level. So can you speak a little bit more to what you see as the causes of the paradigm shift that we've started to talk about, and what you think the priorities are for responding to that paradigm shift?
Sure, absolutely. Thanks, Kristen. So for Democracy Fund, we don't think of this as one paradigm shift, but many. And so we see the challenges of the public square as a web of forces related to economic changes, technological changes, social changes, political changes, and more. Those are all systems, and they're systems that are interacting and intersecting in a kind of tug of war that's reshaping how our communities access and use information in their lives. So understanding these forces and how they shape the public square as a set of systems, it means being aware of unintended consequences. So for an example, a new technology that gives people more freedom to connect and create can also usher in more surveillance and harassment. And so, thinking of these things in systems makes us calls us really to think about those unintended consequences, and calls on us to develop solutions that strike at root causes. And so when I think about those root causes, I think of sort of one overarching principle that I think could and should shape some of our responses. One is that I think we have to center our responses around people and communities. And to do so, we have to have an awareness of power and justice. Those are too often afterthoughts in our current moment. And that has led to growing information inequality that mirrors and follows other forms of inequality. And with that overarching principle in mind, I have a couple other broad buckets that I think the folks on the call later will actually give us much more texture to. So I'll just lay them out here, and then I'm really excited to sort of show what this looks like in action with the panelists later. But I think we need to have new forms of platform accountability, and that means developing mechanisms for accountability for social media platforms that range from public pressure to public policy. I think we need to invest in supporting and expanding journalism that's committed to rebuilding the social contract between communities and newsrooms through on and offline engagement, journalism that is a service, and a deep commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion in the stories, staffing, and sources that are used in the news. And then finally, I think we have to understand that many of the best solutions to recreating the public square are going to be rooted in local knowledge and local responses. And thus, we have to sort of give up on one-size-fits-all models of scale and really approach this fostering more sustainable journalism that reflects unique contexts and builds hand-in-hand with local stakeholders. And so I think each of those things, rebuilding the public square, making sure it's sustainable, and taking on the sort of current challenges and changes in technology, have to kind of all work together.
Great. I'm going to ask one more question. Like you, I'm really eager to get to Sarah and Ashley. So I'm going to ask one more question, and then I'm going to take one question from the Q&A box. So teeing everyone up to make sure you utilize that, and then we'll shift to Sarah and Ashley. But my next question is really about what it means to have a public square right now. I'm sure that's really the focus of today's conversation, and I'm sure that we'll have a very clearly articulated strategy for that done in the next 44 minutes or so. But let me ask both you and Eli, Josh and Eli, to think big. If we were to envision the public square that we need today, what would look different from what we have now, and how would we know that we have achieved it? I don't know which one of you wants to go first. Maybe rock, paper, scissors.
Well, let me zoom in on sort of a micro example of a public square. And to do that, I often think of a local ecosystem of news and information. And so when I think about what does a healthy local news ecosystem looks like as a model of what a larger public square might be, I think of a couple qualities. I think it has to be diverse and sustainable. And so like a natural ecosystem, a healthy media or news ecosystem is strengthened by its diversity. And that diversity includes the people and modes of participation that are involved with it, as well as the different models of news and information, from hyper-local to statewide, small to large, neighborhood news to investigative reporting. We need all of those things. There is no more one-size-fits-all approach to, so one kind of news and information provider. I also envision these healthy news ecosystems to be collaborative and cohesive. It's an ecosystem that balances the need for collaboration, for us to know that the stories and issues that our communities are facing are too big for any one organization to handle alone, and we need to be working together in new ways, as well as thinking about how we follow stories further and make our narratives more cohesive and not sort of chase shiny objects. That's going to help lead us to serving communities better, which will make us relevant and responsive. And that's really the last piece. It has to be relevant to the people, responsive to the people, and reflective of the people who live in that ecosystem.
Thanks, Josh. Eli?
Well, I think this is such an important question. And I think it's especially important because as we kind of move a lot of public conversation, although certainly not all, into the digital realm, we're becoming increasingly untethered from kind of the physical metaphors that have guided how we've thought about this in the past. So you say town square, and there's a literal way that works in a place that no longer totally applies when we're dealing with something as big and woolly and tangled as the internet. And so so this is actually what what I'm working on at New America Foundation with support from Democracy Fund and Omidyar, is trying to get to the bottom of, we've had a lot of conversations in the last 2 years about what we don't like about having platforms intermediate speech, whether it's hate speech or a lack of access or fake news. But I think the vision for what we would like these platforms to deliver and how we would measure that and how we would ask for that, I think is less developed. And so I'm trying to kind of talk to as many people as possible to synthesize some of what might that actually look like in a way that an algorithm or a software engineer would understand and be able to code for. So I just do think that's such a critical question. The one other thought that I'll just throw in is, I think one of the dimensions that worries me most right now is kind of the time dimension. And it's just the sense that to have a real public space or public dialogue, it needs to exist over time. To have a thoughtful conversation, you need time to have it and to respond, and to build a relationship, you need to have time to get to know someone. And it feels to me like by chopping up discourse into such tiny fragments of time, and by hyper optimizing for behavioral signals that happen on a very, very quick, I click a link and immediately that's feeding into the next thing that I'm going to see, that somehow we need to be able to kind of stretch out the time aperture if we want to be able to have a healthy public discourse. And that's sort of challenging given all of the dynamics of how these systems work. But I would say on the first piece, I would love to hear from folks on the call if you have thoughts about this sort of overarching question, because it's really I think it's one of the big questions that we need to answer right now. what are those dynamics?
Vince, I see you're unmuted. Does that mean you want to jump in here?
Yeah, I just wanted to offer a quick advertisement. Eli made a really great presentation at our most recent Media Impact Forum, and we'll post a link to that talk. It was, I think, relevant to this question, and where he sort of lays out a pretty sweeping assessment of how we got here and some things we can do. So for people who want to go a little deeper, Eli shared some pretty interesting observations there too.
Thanks, Vince. And I think Roshni and Sabira are doing a great job at putting some links in the chat box for folks who are following that.
Oh,
and I believe.
yeah, and I'll just say, don't distract yourself by clicking on all the links while we're talking. We'll bundle all of those links and provide them right after this talk.
Thank you so much, Vince. I want to take one quick question and tee everybody up that Sarah and Ashley are going to come immediately following this. But we do have a question that I think is really interesting from Kami, who one of the things when we talk about public and public engagement, a theme that seems to be coming up a lot lately is the idea of civility and what civility in the public square looks like. And so his question is really around when we think about fostering civility in person in public conversations or public engagement versus fostering civility online. Do you see those things being about the same challenges, and how do we support the idea of civility as a value that animates the public square in those ways? Eli?
Should I jump in here?
Yes.
Great. Well, it's interesting that you raised this question because I would say in the interviews that I've been doing so far, civility has both come up a lot, but also it's been one of the areas that, has been the most controversial in a way, which is, I think, and for the project that I'm working on now, we've actually kind of taken the stance that civility might be the wrong word for what we mean here. Because civility so often means how it's understood by many people is as a kind of like deference to authority and willingness to go along with the norms of whatever the dominant group is in a particular area. Generally politeness is determined by whoever is the majority. And so I think it's worth just pulling apart civility versus humanization. That we would never want to dehumanize, and that humanization is a very worthy goal, but that at the same time it's possible to, if you think about speaking truth to power, that might take a tone that's pretty strong, and if we can hold that and humanize the people we're talking to, then we've really got something. And so that doesn't really answer the question of how one creates civility, but to me, in some ways, I would rather have humanization than civility can kind of feel like a veneer that papers over the deeper problems of seeing each other as stereotypes or as less than.
Thanks for that important distinction. Great. Well, let's transition to Sarah and Ashley, because as we think about what it means to create a public square that serves all members of our democracy, Sarah and Ashley are both really on the forefront of thinking about that in any number of ways and helping to make that a reality. So we've asked each of them to share a little bit about their work and what it means and looks like in action. So first, we're going to turn it to Sarah. Sarah Alvarez is of Outlier Media, which is making strides to tackle the information gap in Detroit. So Sarah, you want to spend a few minutes helping us understand your work?
Sure. Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me. So I'm going to talk about what we're doing here at Outlier. I'm not going to talk too much about what we do in terms of the nuts and bolts, because you can see that on your phone the way that our news consumers do. So if you didn't get the link already, you can text the word demo to the number 63735. And that's really going to kind of take you through what we do day to day. Josh said earlier, that information inequality can mirror and follow other kinds of inequality. And here in Detroit, what I see is that information inequality is really begetting and compounding other types of inequality. So it's something that, we take really seriously, and the whole model of Outlier is really built on filling information gaps, because we are looking, I think the vision of a public square that I'm hoping for is a healthier information ecosystem where the news and information needs of low-income individuals have value. That's what we want to see. That's what we want to try to build. And also where like the primary focus of accountability journalism is like directly responsive and proportional to the largest existing information and accountability gaps. Where like the things that are troubling the biggest number of people, however unsexy they are what is going to lead your coverage if you're doing watchdog reporting and accountability reporting. And I just want to be clear that information gaps are not the same as news deserts. We have a lot of news here in Detroit, and we also have very persistent and very pervasive information gaps. And I see Jay Hamilton, read all the things, his thinking and work around information gaps is so important to what we do here at Outlier. But the way that I think about an information gap is that it leads to an accountability gap. Detroiters are not the target news consumers for anybody other than Outlier, because most people who live in Detroit are low income, and that means that even the news organizations within Detroit are targeting a suburban news consumer. So what people here in Detroit have most is in terms of news is entertainment first, definitely, breaking news, then some explanatory journalism. Stephen Henderson on WDT does a great job of that. And then service journalism last of all. And what I really want to see is an inversion of that, where what we see first is service, then explanatory, then breaking, then entertainment. So that's really kind of where I would like to see things. When we first started, so Outlier is just starting its third year, and the first 2 years were really trying to build the thing and test the model. So when we were first doing this, people could text in an address. I did a bunch of reporting on the front end based on what 211 told me were the biggest kind of accountability and resource gaps. So that was housing. Now it's utilities. But we first, someone could text in their address and they would get back a short report on who owned it, what the tax situation was, if it was going to be auctioned, and when places in that zip code needed to be registered as a rental. And then we were following up with people. We followed up with about 40% of our users. I should say we buy numbers like a marketer, but we're a nonprofit and we're not marketing. We are just giving people an opportunity to engage with us. And we really want to hit the biggest, we want to hit the most people. We want the biggest swath of the public that we can get. And so we can't piggyback on any existing news source because those don't have a big swath of the public. So now what we do every day is we text out messages to about 5,000 numbers a day. We give everybody three choices of information to pick from, and that's an automated thing. And then there's one that always gets a follow-up, and that's around utilities, because we don't have enough information yet to offer something of value first. We're still kind of gathering information about what people could use in terms of utilities. Our success rate really varies. We only see a small handful of unsubscribes, but we also don't know if people are getting our messages, and ignoring them, or if they're just if these messages are going into the ether because the numbers we buy are really cheap. We interact with about 80 people a day right now, and we're exploring bigger stories and news products with about 15 sources at all times. And we work with most newsrooms in Detroit as publishing partners. There's only a few, I think 2 that we haven't worked with. And we're building more meaningful and revenue sharing partnerships with Detroit Detour and WDT. And my time is up, but I just want to say, like, I think that our model is effective for 3 reasons. I mean, it's effective, but like, look at the bags under my eyes. Like, it is a lot of work. This is a very small operation. Up until a month ago, it was a 1-person operation. Now it's a 2-person operation, and we're able to get a ton done. And I think we're effective because we're really focused, we're super coherent, and we're incredibly local. And we know what our value is. It's in the information that we have, it's in the access we have, and it's in our investigative capacity. And we are not hoarding this value, we are redistributing it. And we are making it as public as we possibly can. And I think that that's why we're successful so far. And, you know, I think we do want to be around for some years to come, because I don't see anybody else kind of filling this need here in Detroit yet.
Thanks so much, Sarah. And I think your eyes look great, for the record.
Oh, thanks, man.
I'm sensing a theme so far that I'm wondering if we'll continue in our conversation. Each of our speakers so far has used some variation on the word redistribute, which is, I'm just noting and observing that as an emerging theme, and maybe we can pull on that a little bit further as the conversation continues. But I would love to right now turn it to Ashley with a quick plug to folks that as soon as Ashley's done, we're going to open it up for questions. So please use the Q&A box to get those sent in. But with no further ado, I'm pleased to introduce Ashley Alvarado of KPCC, Southern California's public radio station, where she leads the station's community engagement and outreach efforts. Ashley?
Hello, thank you so much for having me. I want to start by saying that through my work at KPCC and the website we acquired earlier this year, LAist, and then also as the board president of Journalism That Matters, I'm really interested in looking at ways that we can practice platform agnostic engagement work that will survive without the specific platforms, but also gives us the opportunity to leverage those platforms to provide maximum engagement. And with all of that, it means that we lead with deep listening and that we follow with a deep commitment to public service. And I'm so fortunate to be at an organization that really is mission driven and willing to go along with these ideas that I have, that, you know, don't necessarily have that immediate, you know, you can't look at them and go, well, that's going to make us money. But instead think about, you know, what are we doing in order to reach new audiences, deepen our relationship with those audiences, and better our journalism. And so one of the projects that's really become a passion project for me and my co-producer, John Cohn, is a live storytelling series called Unheard LA. And what was so amazing about this is that when California Wellness Foundation came in a couple years ago, they bought into the need for us to really clearly assess what the assets were that we were bringing to the project, and to lead with engagement. So we spent 4 months going into community, revisiting folks that we've worked with through engagement efforts in the past, and to say, you know, we have a stage, we have a microphone, but you have a story and you have a perspective of Los Angeles that nobody else has, and to commit to putting these perspectives on center stage, with very little. We're not going to say that we don't do any edits and that we don't do any coaching, because we do, but we never, you know, one of I feel like we're always developing our own cliches. And one of them is that, you know, we never want to polish the you out of you. We want to let those stories shine on stage. And so when we launched our first season in 2016 as a pilot season of 3 shows, or 2017, excuse me, we expected to have smaller audiences. You know, we were looking for theater venues in the 150, maybe 200 seat range, and discovered that as littered as Los Angeles is with theaters, that's not the easiest venue size to find with the production capability that we needed. So we ended up in venues that could fit 400 or so folks. But we did this, we committed to these stories, we worked with individuals from throughout Southern California, and we not only, one other thing I want to say is important is we never tell people anything beyond who's in the show. But we don't say what they're talking about. It's just an opportunity for folks to come meet fellow Angelenos and to explore Los Angeles one story at a time. And in that first season, we ended up hitting capacity at all 3 venues, despite their larger size. We had the youngest, most diverse audiences that we've really ever had. And when we looked at the data, and we're still doing this for season 2, we discovered that more than 80% of those people who are RSVPing had never RSVP'd for one of our events before. So I think that in talking about how we take off sort of our roles of deciding what matters to others, and we just open up the space for folks to listen, we find that there is a there. We also, we were really intentional on what we named it, because there are a lot of stories that go untold. But one of the things that we understand is that there are more stories that go unheard because of the loudest voice in the room, the dominant voice in the room. And we wanted to make space for that. We came back earlier this year with a 6-show second season, and then just announced that California Wellness Foundation has come back and agreed to support us for 2 additional years, which is just really extraordinary. One of the things that I've loved about their support, and we talked about this a little bit in our prep calls for this, is there's an allowance for us to not look at the traditional sort of logic model of how we deliver on these shows. There's a lot of flexibility for us to say that we're figuring this out as we go along, and we're building more and more engagement into the process as we go. I'm hitting my 5 minutes, so I just, I'm happy to answer any and all questions, and to be here to support the conversation.
Thanks so much, Ashley. That was great. We have one question in the Q&A box, and a reminder to folks, this functionality is a little bit different in that there is a Q&A box and a chat box. So to make sure that we don't lose track of your question, if you have a question that you're hoping for a response for, please include it in the Q&A box. If you're sharing a comment or a resource, please include that in the chat box. Sorry for any confusion, but we want to make sure we don't miss anything. There is a question in the Q&A box specifically for Sarah. And it says, is the project based on data indicating people's interest in receiving texts? I know text campaigns are not always well received, but it would be interesting to know how they play differently in different districts and with different socioeconomic sectors. Also, you may have mentioned this, but did you choose a text message-based model based on lack of access or engagement in the communities that you target, presuming then that text might be the most effective way to reach them?
Yep. So I'm like Ashley, a platform agnostic. So we chose SMS because that's what works here in Detroit, because we did know, based on work by Jesse Holcomb at Pew, that people did want to get information on their phones. And we also know here that folks do not have, most people don't have data plans and are using public Wi-Fi. So that's why we choose SMS. And it works well for us, but the minute it changes, we will change too.
Okay, great. Well, while we're waiting for some more questions to come in, I have one that I would like to ask to both of you, and then I wonder if Josh and Eli would have thoughts on it as well. Sarah, you both talked about changing the game in different ways. Sarah, you talked about trying to create new infrastructure to tackle challenges and meet needs that were unmet. And Ashley, you talked about trying to re-envision or reshape an idea of an existing infrastructure. Can you talk a little bit more about if and how you see those both and approaches, building new and remodeling and ensuring the integrity of the old, and how those come together and why both are important?
Sure, I'll start. If I worked for KPCC, I would do the same thing that Ashley's doing. It's an amazing organization, and they do support this type of experimentation. We just didn't have that here in Detroit, so that's why I don't really think I'm building infrastructure as much as just kind of starting to catalyze some change. And what I do hope that we see is more of a federation of news organizations that are committed to serving the information needs of all Detroiters. And I'm just, doing what I can to make that happen. And right now, I think it needs to be outside of any existing organization, because none of the existing organizations yet have the capacity, and I think even more so the willingness to really focus in on this audience. But again, once they do, I would be like, then we will have outlived our utility, I think. And I am fine with that. Ashley, what do you think?
Well, I'm not fine with you outliving your utility, but I think at KPCC, I'm so lucky to have a chief content officer who's really bought into engagement, and a director of institutional giving who gets it and who is advocating for it. And so as we're doing these different efforts, whether it's Unheard LA or we're doing, I'm in the process of bundling 6,000 postcards for direct mail. We're doing it because we're getting the opportunity to invest in human-centered design and to meet people, sometimes literally on the street, and to do these interviews to see what is the opportunity that we have to offer a unique and relevant resource. Because I think with so many of these conversations, they're either completely ignored or flooded with resources that aren't necessarily getting the job done. And so when I think about the early childhood space, or right now we're doing human-centered design ahead of the 2020 census, there are a ton of organizations, especially in Southern California, working on the census. But as you interview individuals, including individuals who are at the highest risk of being undercounted, or who you would assume know about what's happening with the 2020 census, there's very little understanding or awareness of what's going on. And so we're taking the time to think about how do we create a unique news service and a distribution model that will reach the people who most need information. I don't know if that answered your question, but it was what I really wanted to say.
Thanks so much. We've got a couple of really great questions coming in, but I want to see if Josh or Eli want to weigh in on either of the kind of infrastructure questions.
I think for those of us in philanthropy, deciding on whether to invest in new things or to try to shape and support old things and their transition into new modes of operating is one that I think a lot of foundations in their strategy development and reviewing their portfolios run into. And I think it's going to look different for every foundation depending on how you operate and your goals. For us, especially in our ecosystem news work, which is our local journalism efforts, we really believe that both new and old models have a lot to teach each other. And so I think so often it is actually about not coming with a top-down sort of replicable, scalable model, but actually thinking about how do you replicate intelligence or share and exchange knowledge. So, it's easy to look at something like legacy ethnic media outlets and say like, oh my God, they need to get with digital. We need to get them good websites. We need to get them Facebook groups. We need to get them all these things, and ignore the fact that they have survived by being deeply enmeshed with their communities for many years. And they have so much to teach legacy newsrooms and new digital newsrooms about deep service to community and about how you develop community around information. And so I think that there's these opportunities for knowledge exchange that take us out of kind of either the mode that we have to fix or create, and instead think about how we share and build together.
Mm-hmm.
If I could jump in real quickly, I would say to this sort of idea of dual transformation, or how the different strategies can feed each other. We're not, when we talk about everything that we're doing at KPCC, we're not going to abandon the radio. We're not going to abandon the type of storytelling that has earned a really loyal and local audience. We're just looking at how do we make sure that the journalism our reporters and producers are doing reaches those who would be best served by the information, in addition to those who really enjoy the packaging and the sound of it.
We have a couple of really great questions coming in, so I hope we'll have time to get to all of them. The first one that I want to lift up says from Ernie, thank you, Ernie. I believe the term public square implies that there is real communication among audiences with diverse perspectives, including divergent political views. In many of the ideas that have been circulated, it seems that political moderates might be the most likely to participate, and polarized voters on both ends of the spectrum may be less likely to engage. Thoughts, or are there solutions to drawing in polarized populations? So does that idea of moderates or people willing to act in moderation resonate with the types of people that you're seeing coming to your programs? And if so, if not, then help us understand that. If so, how might we bring in people who might be a little bit more polarized in some ways to ensure they can contribute meaningfully and legitimately, and also have their voices heard and hear others' voices as well? Who wants to take that? Eli?
Well, it's a great question, and speaks to some of the complication of even kind of having the right conceptual framework for what we're trying to do here. You know, I think one of the things that's worth saying is, oops, I lost, there we go. You know, it's easy to fall into, it's much more comfortable to think about these things as kind of symmetrical problems where there are partisans on both sides, there are moderates in the middle. And one of the challenges of the information landscape that we're living in is actually like, it's deeply asymmetrical. And obviously I come at this from a progressive, you know, left point of view, but just empirically, you know, the structure of media on the right is very different than the structure of media on the left. The structure of engagement is different. The number of people who kind of consider themselves, you know, kind of hardcore right partisans is much larger than the number of people who consider themselves hardcore left partisans. And so I think there's some danger in imagining that there's a solution that is symmetrical. And instead, I think, as Josh has pointed out, and Sarah and others on the call, you know, it's useful to kind of get a little more granular about who and where we're talking about, because it's a lot easier in some ways to conceptualize what this looks like in a particular community than it is to try to think about how we all engage everyone in some. This is essentially what Twitter is and why Twitter is so difficult, because there is no ordering principle. But I think what I heard Josh say and others is that, you know, in some ways it's easier to build a public square in a place where there's some identity, some local identity that helps glue things together. That would be my thought on that question.
So there's another question. I want to hear other folks' thoughts on this too, but there's another question that came in that I think related to a point that you were making, Eli, and it's actually directed specifically towards you, about is there value in engaging in closed groups as ways to maybe help with some of the dynamics that you've talked about. So the person who asked the question, Elizabeth, says there are problems with groups, of course, that are not open to everyone, but do you think there is potential in closed groups to stretch out dialogues or maybe have more symmetrical or more meaningful discussion in the way that you described?
Yeah, so this is, I mean, 2019, a lot of the conversation about how online discourse works, I think, is going to be about closed groups. And they're sort of like the very worst and the very best. Like, that's where you get, you know, skinheads coordinating to do their Charlottesville thing. But it's also, I think, where you start to build spaces where people can organize together, share experiences, whether it's across difference like Spaceship Media is doing, or whether it's, you know, across a shared identity, like there are these very powerful groups of mothers whose kids have been killed in gun violence that have really changed the shape of that issue. One of the reasons I do think, so I guess I would say, like, as with many technological things, the technology itself isn't going to dictate what happens. It's a combination of technology and society. I think that the thing that closed groups allow for, which is positive, is the development of kind of thicker norms. That when you have a closed group, it's easier to kind of like agree on a shared set of behavior. And that's one of the things that's so difficult in public online space, and that makes it such a like unforgiving environment. And so I do think it's definitely the place that conversation is going more and more. And I think that can be a good thing. But I think, there's certainly also lots of places where it's super problematic.
Thoughts from others on this question around moderation and polarization, and or taking on the closed group question as well?
I guess I wanted to just hold up 3 projects that this made me think of. And so this is for those of you on the call, something to look at after the call would be an organization called Spaceship Media, which is really trying to do work in this exact sort of intersection and really engage these questions around getting politically diverse groups together to talk across difference. Another one is Your Voice Ohio from the Jefferson Center. And then the last one is a project called News Voices from Free Press. And so each of those projects really is about bringing a new set of skills into media and journalism, and that the skill set is that of relationship builder. Heather Bryant, somebody who I definitely encourage you reading, who has some recent posts up at the Membership Puzzle Project. She has recently written that one of the things that newsrooms and many other organizations who are key parts of our public square are lacking is the skill set around relationship building. Mm-hmm. And I would argue that for any organization, working and caring about the public square, there used to be this kind of like digital trope about like, let's teach everyone to code. Like I would say, okay, let's teach everyone to convene. Let's teach everyone how to gather and facilitate. Let's figure out how we kind of embed relationship-driven and building skills into these critical institutions of our public square, because I think that's where we begin to see how journalism and media can be a facilitative force to bring people together, and how not just dialogue in person, but actually reporting, investigative journalism can help bridge differences and find commonalities and solve problems together.
Sarah or Ashley, do you want to jump in on this question?
Sure. So what I would say is that one of the things that Josh was just talking about that I've been thinking about a lot when it comes to both the hat I wear at KPCC and the hat I wear with the nonprofit Journalism That Matters is that as we start to have more spaces in which we can practice engagement, we need to spend more time thinking about how we study and learn the practice of engagement. And some of what I learned from one of the co-founders of Journalism That Matters, and that has really informed my work as a journalist, is open space technology, other types of facilitation, World Cafe, which I know Fiona Morgan with the New Jersey work was employing quite a bit, and thinking about how we open up conversation and create not safe spaces necessarily, but welcoming spaces so that there's room to have conflict and conversation, but also to work through it. One of my favorite facilitation resources is it has a terrible name. It's called The Wind Flows, but it's everybody who is in a conference space or convening will get in a circle, and the facilitators start by saying, "The wind flows for everyone who fill in the blank." And it starts with the facilitators, and then it without fail, every time I've done it, people in the group start to give suggestions. And so what may have started with half of the people, because whenever there's something that speaks to your experience, you cross the room. And so you get this real visual representation of what folks have in common, so that they are then able to start to look beyond their big differences. And one moment that continues to stick with me was we were at a convening of primarily journalists, and it started with, the wind flows for those who are a parent, the wind flows for those who have who don't have an advanced degree. And at one point, a journalist said, "The wind flows for anybody who has a family member who's been incarcerated." And you have this room full of journalists who then take a step and just look at how many, I think it was a third to half of the people in the room crossed it just changed the dynamic for the entire rest of the convening. And so I think that when we start to invest in the building of practice, then we're able to more expertly, or at least more effectively, facilitate these conversations.
That's really interesting. And this idea of welcoming spaces, I think, relates to probably the last question that we're going to have time for today, but I'd love to continue this theme. The question says, while the idea of public square seems to transcend cultures or borders, I wonder what your thoughts are regarding engaging those communities that may not yet see themselves as part of their cities or their communities. In other words, what do you think is the role of a sense of belonging? What do you think is the role a sense of belonging plays in the idea of a public square, and whose voices are currently, perhaps inadvertently, being excluded or self-excluded from those conversations? Really important question, and picks up on exactly what you were just talking about, Ashley. Anybody want to weigh in on that? Sarah?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that is why these projects really need to reach the broadest segment of the public that you can, right? Like, if we can't continue to let people self-select into, or because like self-selection is really not self-selection, right? We're really like opening the door to who's already like very close by. So unless you have these kind of checks in your process that will open up whatever information you're trying to redistribute, or whatever kind of access you're trying to redistribute, or whatever kind of public good you're trying to redistribute, you have to really have ways where you're going to open those doors very wide, and then where you're going to have a feedback loop that tells you whether or not you're doing a good job. And I think that those two things are incredibly critical, because I also think that in the area of engagement, and particularly in communities or amongst people who have been more marginalized, or who are just like undervalued, there's a lot of experimentation, and that's not something that like we want to perpetuate, none of us here on this call. And the way that you do that is by keeping those feedback loops very tight and being very, very careful with that methodology and practice.
Any final thoughts before we move to close? Ashley, were you wanting to continue?
Yeah, sorry. I mean, I think the first thing I want to say is I really value what Josh and the team at Democracy Fund have done in how they think about and how they frame a lot of these conversations, because there is understanding that when we're talking about engaged journalism, when we're talking about being more inclusive or more effective in our work, we have to also have the conversation of diversity and inclusion, and that we have to be thinking about, you know, who's in the newsroom, who's making these decisions, and how are we approaching different efforts. You know, I'm working on something right now around Black infant mortality, and even as we have one of the more diverse audiences in Southern California, African Americans make up 8% of our listenership. And so if I'm thinking about reaching folks, I can't just say, well, we're going to do something and put it on our air, because that's not most effective. And so then we have to be thinking about, what can we do, what makes sense, what doesn't feel like parachuting in, and how do we make the proper investment that's prolonged and authentic.
Well, we are nearing the top of the hour, and I want to be very respectful of everyone's time, but thank you to all of you for, I feel like we've just scratched the surface of a much deeper, very valuable, important conversation. I want to thank Vince and his team, Roshni and Sabira at Media Impact Funders, for partnering with us on this. This will not be the last partnership between PACE and Media Impact Funders on this topic, and so please be on the lookout. We'll send the follow-up information, the recording, the resources and everything from this call, and then be on the lookout for an invitation to another webinar early in the new year. Perhaps we could pick up on one of the two very good questions that we did not get to, but I want to acknowledge from the chat box. One around how do you measure this? Which is a really important question. Equally important, but very different question. How do we understand the consequences of rapidly expanding privatization. So just to illuminate that there are many ways we could take this conversation, Adiel and my team and I at PACE look forward to working with media impact funders and all of you to continue it. So thank you so much. Vince, final words?
Yeah, I'd just like to close thanking you, Kristen and Adiel, and especially Roshni Melia on our team and everybody else on my team who's participated in this. We would need 2 hours for this conversation, and while we don't have that today, we have actually agreed with the PACE funders to take 2 hours, and we are, I think, closing in on some last ideas for the session at the toward the end of January. But we'll be sharing more with all of you about that session as well. I would also note that one of the other things we didn't get to, Ellen Schneider from Active Voice also had a resource she wanted to share. We'll note that in the links, and we will share the links and all the materials that we've been highlighting. I just want to also put a brief advertisement in for 2 upcoming webinars, one just tomorrow. Everybody, a lot of people have mentioned Fiona Morgan on our team. She'll be leading a discussion on news deserts. A lot of people have already signed up for that, but it's not too late for anybody who wants to learn more about news deserts. And something maybe you haven't been paying attention to, but next week we're going to be convening a special discussion with authors of 2 new books. One is Max King, president of the Pittsburgh Foundation and author of the new authorized biography of Fred Rogers, The Good Neighbor, the life and work of Fred Rogers. And the other book is by Joy Moore, a longtime board member of Media Impact Funders, author of The Power of Presence. And those 2 are going to be talking about really issues in early childhood, but issues of parenting too. So if you're a parent, if you have children, if you have grandchildren, if ever you were a child, this is a conversation that will be really fascinating. We just did the planning call with them, and it's going to be a really interesting dialogue. So I hope all of you will come back with us next week, next Wednesday, midday as well. So thank you all. It was a great discussion today, and we look forward to many more. Thanks.
Yeah.